Hello and welcome to the IEA podcast. This is a quick IEA briefing with Christian Niemietz, our editorial director, who has written for CapX on Corbyn and his latest speech in Jamaica. Christian, Jeremy Corbyn lost the general election in a resounding defeat almost exactly 5 years ago. Why are we still talking about him?
Well, I'd say nowadays he matters not so much as a politician, but as a social media influencer, because he has 2.6 million Twitter followers. And that is more than the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition and the Chancellor of the Exchequer combined. And the difference is also, it's not just about the numbers, but it's that if you follow Corbyn today, you probably do that because you really are an adoring fan. Whereas if you follow Keir Starmer or Kemi Badenoch, well, it's just because they have a particular position in politics and therefore what they say matters. But in Corbyn's case, we can safely assume that the vast majority of them really are adoring fans. And so this Corbyn cult that we saw in the last decade, that didn't really go away. A lot of these people have not moved on. He gets a lot of engagement for everything he says. And most of the time, it's just the lamest anti-capitalist cliches. So he's just simply part of that Twitter tribe of people who come up with anti-capitalist cliches, but who set the tone. So a lot of people see that this is the fashionable opinion and just want to go along with it because a lot of people just want to be on the fashionable side of the argument.
The latest in one of those fashionable cliches and his intervention into the public debate, he did a speech in Jamaica recently on reparations and colonialism. I'd like to pull out a quick quote that you highlighted in your article. He claims, quote, "Decades of colonialism have created a profoundly unequal world that concentrates wealth and power in the hands of the global few. Britain's foundations were built off the backs of others, of generations of enslaved and colonial subjects." What do you make of that?
Well, it's a very short quote, but it encapsulates a whole worldview. So Corbyn and his fan club genuinely believe that the British Empire and the transatlantic slave trade, that these are not simply dark chapters in the past, but rather that these are the foundations on which the prosperity of the country and of the Western world in general is built. And if you take that view, if you believe that the main reason why we are relatively rich nowadays is that we exploited other people, other parts of the world in the past. Well, what does that mean? It means you're not going to develop much of an appreciation for the economic system which made that prosperity possible. Whereas if, like most economists, if you believe that the Western world is rich because we developed better institutions than the rest of the world and better economic policies, then you would draw the conclusion, well, maybe we got something right, if more by accident than by design. And if that is the case, maybe we should think about what that is. And maybe we should build on those strengths rather than dismiss them or tear them down. Whereas if you take the Corbynite view, you would see the Western world is just an aggressor, a plunderer, and you would draw the conclusion that there's nothing to be learned from that model, because you would see that as the equivalent of, say, a criminal gang, of, say, the mafia, where, it's not a model that everyone can emulate because there's only so many people who can be plundered.
So you don't agree with his general thesis, which is understandable. And because then we can't accept the wins and the successes that our current system has done if we accept that actually our wealth has been plundered from elsewhere. But what evidence do you have, or what's your argument about the general benefits or the benefits that we drew from slavery and the empire in more broad terms? Is the UK much richer because of its history, through that Corbynite lens?
Yeah, I've looked at the figures, or at least the ones that I could find for the imperial history, in Imperial Measurement, short book that I wrote on this, and what I found is simply some families got extremely rich through the slave trade and other forms of colonial exploitation. But on the whole, if you add it all up, it's just nowhere near enough to explain a phenomenon like the Industrial Revolution, which required colossal amounts of capital investment and was a complete game changer in the economic history of the world. And in that context, the gains from colonialism were either too small to really explain that much of that big change. And it's quite possible that these gains were zero or even negative. Because while we can, of course, say that Britain benefited in the form of having wider markets and all that, that also came at a cost. So Britain had very high levels of military spending at the time because the slave trade itself, and then later the conquest of colonies and the ongoing occupation that had to be paid for. That would be, like in today's terms, like a military campaign. That's extremely expensive, especially in places where colonial rule isn't widely accepted, and you have to fight the resistance to that. That's even pure, apart from the immorality of it, that's just not good economics. And especially if we bear in mind that a lot of the trade with the colonies could have happened if they had not been colonies. So this is a bit like you may remember in the early days of the EU referendum campaign. There was a figure that was making the rounds that if Britain leaves the EU, 3 million jobs will be lost. And one of my then colleagues, Ryan Bourne, looked at this figure. He wrote about this. He said, he looked at where this comes from. He said, what this means is simply there are about 3 million jobs that depend on trade with the EU. But trade with the EU doesn't mean membership of the EU. And in the same way, trade with colonies doesn't entirely depend on them being colonies. Colonialism, empire is a political status, but it's really the trade that we're interested in. Now, Remainers can, and some did, realistically argue that there will be less trade with the EU if we're not members. That membership means it facilitates trade, and in the same way, you can make the argument that trade with India, with Jamaica, with other parts of the empire, trade volumes were higher than they would have been compared to a situation where they had remained independent countries or where they had been colonized maybe by other European powers. That's a plausible claim. But some of the trade would have happened anyway. So you can't attribute all the gains from trade within the empire to the fact that there was an empire.
But the fact, so that's a very good argument. But the fact is that there was an empire, so that did some negative things and was involved in slavery. So do you not think that there is some level of reparations that we owe for that?
Well, first of all, I think there's nothing wrong with acknowledging the wrongs of the past, and you can do that in a way that doesn't become woke, progressive self-flagellation. I mean, that's just history. There's nothing wrong with talking about that, and there's absolutely no need to sweep that under the carpet. So therefore, I would distinguish my economic arguments from some of the national conservative arguments where they try to defend the empire or try to say that it was actually a good thing or that it wasn't that big a deal compared to other empires. I'm not doing anything of that sort. I don't have a problem with people highlighting the wrongs that were committed under imperial rule, and that's part of history, and there's nothing wrong with highlighting that. What I would reject is simply the interpretation that is what made the country rich. I'll say purely in economic terms, that is not true. We can talk about it. We can have all sorts of exhibitions in the British Museum highlighting what happened during the imperial period. That's all well and good. But I would not draw any economic conclusions from it. And on the reparations front, well, that requires you to believe in a notion of collective inherited guilt, in the idea that you can somehow be held responsible for something that your ancestors, or maybe not even your immediate ancestors, but just people who lived in the same place 3 generations ago, or 4 or 5, that you can somehow be held responsible for what these people were doing at the time. Now, that is a principle which we would not accept in other circumstances. So if I found some evidence that, say, your great-grandfather stole something from mine, it wouldn't hold up in court. If I said, well, you owe me some kind of reparations now, some kind of compensation, that's not the way our legal system works in general, and for good reason. And if we don't accept that logic in other circumstances, then we shouldn't say, well, we'll make an exception here because it fits so nicely into our progressive culture war.
And of course, there are better ways, we would argue, I think, to help the places that were harmed by slavery in the continent of Africa and elsewhere through the likes of free trade, which we believe could do much better to help those places rather than sort of direct transfers of taxpayer money from the European Western America, for example. Would you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, these are the no regrets policies. Free trade is something that, of course, we believe in anyway, and that's something that we support irrespective of whether a country or region was ever colonized or not. This is completely independent of that. And yes, we should definitely maximize those opportunities where both sides can benefit. And trade is very much like that, whereas a reparations payment is really a zero-sum transfer from one place to another. And I also can't see how reparations would be different from conventional overseas aid. So just because you call a transfer a reparations payment, okay, that's a fancy name that you can give it. But how does that differ from the kind of overseas aid that we already have? And okay, some of it is defensible, but overall, I think most economists would agree overseas aid is not in general the way to make poor countries rich. So it doesn't really help much with overall economic development. What you can do is support specific causes, say flood protection somewhere. You can improve some social and humanitarian outcomes, and that's all well and good. But it's not something that boosts general overall economic development.
And just to finish, how optimistic are you of persuading Corbyn or his over 2 million Twitter followers that actually free trade is the answer, because the British government, or the British state, hasn't benefited that much from its empire and slavery history?
Well, they wouldn't accept it on those grounds, but it's generally a bit tricky. I guess Corbyn and most of his fans wouldn't really have strong views on trade policy. So for them, this would be very much vibes based. And you can see this right now in the responses to some of the things that Donald Trump is coming up with, where he is against the North American free trade agreement. That used to be a standard left-wing position in the 90s and early 2000s. And now most of the left is against it because it is now right-coded because Trump is doing it. So, yeah, I don't think Corbynites would get the argument for free trade. They might oppose it. They might oppose protectionism if they associate it with Donald Trump. But then that would be the wrong reason. That would just be, okay, here's somebody we don't like, somebody who has the wrong vibes, proposing a specific policy. Therefore, we must be against it.
Christian, thank you for that. Thank you for listening to the IEA podcast 2. We will be back shortly with more from our experts here. You can find more of our work on Substack at insider.iea.org.uk. Until next time, thanks very much.